There's a word that gets applied to a tired marathon runner, a burned out CrossFitter, and a powerlifter who has missed their working set weights for multiple weeks. That word is overtrained. The assumption embedded in that word is that these three people share the same underlying condition, though this is almost certainly wrong. In 2022, researchers conducted the most rigorous systematic review ever performed on overtraining syndrome. They were looking specifically for studies that could objectively document a human being transitioning from a healthy training state to an overtrained state under controlled experimental conditions. 0 studies met those criteria. Now, this isn't an argument that something real isn't happening to these athletes. There's substantial observational, retrospective, and case-based evidence that athletes experience something during periods of prolonged excessive training load. But what that finding does tell us is that overtraining syndrome, as a concept, has been built on observation and retrospect, not the kind of controlled experimental evidence we need to confidently explain what it is, how to identify it, or even what to do about it. And as we'll argue today, the problem may not just be that we lack good studies. It may be that the concept itself is pointing in the wrong direction. Today, we're going to pull apart what the evidence actually shows, where it ends, and what that means practically for how you train and how you recover. And to help me manage today's training load within appropriate recovery resources, it's the second most handsome doctor in North America, Dr. Austin Baraki. What's going on, man?
Hey, doing all right. Just finished some training this morning myself. Despite my best efforts, I still have not yet found a way to do too much, but here we are.
But you're trying.
I'm trying to.
Let's start why this is actually a difficult problem to solve, because if it were simple, somebody would have done it already. And I think it starts with the labeling. Like the word overtraining appears in coaching certifications, wearable device dashboards, on social media, and also even in like clinical sports medicine guidelines. And in each of those different contexts, it means something different. So the same word, overtraining, is doing at least 4 different jobs at the same time. Within a coaching certifications text, it can mean a deliberate training stimulus that you're supposed to apply to drive a fitness adaptation, which is also called overreaching. Or it could also be a dangerous failure state that you're supposed to avoid at all costs. But the same manual sometimes uses the same word for both without acknowledging that these are distinctly different things. Unlike wearable tech, like a watch or something like that, it can mean whatever the algorithm that device was trained on senses that you're, quote, overtrained without having anything to do with the clinical definition. In social media, it means I trained a lot and now I feel bad, which is decidedly vague.
Yeah.
And in the sports medicine literature, it refers to a specific diagnosis of exclusion that requires ruling out things like thyroid dysfunction, anemia, low energy availability, depression, illness, et cetera, before you can apply the label. Now, these aren't minor variations of the same concept. They're just different phenomena that imply different sort of management. So if a coach tells an athlete they are overtrained compared to when a sports medicine physician uses the same word, they mean different things. And so it's understandable, like this confusion around overtraining, not only what it is, but what to do about it. At least 4 different definitions. And I think this is not a unique problem to sports medicine or exercise science. This happens all the time. Austin, have you seen this in medicine where like the same word is used across maybe different, to mean different things in medicine?
Yeah, it's hard to think of a ton of examples just off the top of my head, but sometimes like lay person language slips into clinical conversations, and that leads to like imprecision around things. One that immediately comes to mind now is the claim or describing somebody as being dehydrated. And so if we have any like nephrologists in the audience, they will know what I'm talking about, because when you say that somebody is dehydrated, from a medical, physiologic, nephrologist's perspective, it means they don't have enough like free water in their body and they should be like hypernatremic and things like that. Whereas if somebody is hypovolemic, that has a different implication, but people use those words interchangeably. And so it is they actually have quite different management strategies. And so that imprecision leads to confusion when the terms are applied vaguely. Although in practice, a lot of the time, when I hear somebody use the term dehydration, I recognize that they really mean hypovolemia. And I'm like, yeah, I know what you mean. But sometimes when I'm feeling a little spicy, I'll pick on them for it. But yeah, it happens in a lot of contexts.
You see it all the time also in the wellness industry, gut health, spine health, brain health. And it's like, all right, what are we talking about exactly?
Right.
Yeah. And so that, there's more of an issue than just the terminology. It's kind of like what the origin story, the villain arc of overtraining syndrome. How did it become a diagnosis in the first place? It's kind of just retrospective in nature. The exercise science field sports medicine field observed a pattern. Some individuals, after periods of high training loads, experienced prolonged performance decrements. They also had mood disturbances and hormonal changes sometimes that did not resolve with a reduction in training load. And so they called that overtraining syndrome. And then, and this is the step that matters, they started treating the name as though it identified a specific disease or pathology with a specific mechanism. And then their diagnostic criteria were built around the label. Decades of research followed that, studied the label rather than kind of the underlying biology. We should state that, naming something, a pattern, is not the same as identifying a disease. Naming a syndrome is not the same as identifying a disease. The athletes or individuals are experiencing something real for sure, but whether those symptoms share a single underlying cause or whether overtraining syndrome is several different problems producing similar presentations, it's never really been established. In the opener, I stated, we've been trying to identify, like, how do you cause overtraining syndrome, right? And like, how do you take somebody from a healthy, right, normally training, with the given training load, and then generate overtraining syndrome? It's never been done. So the concept of overtraining syndrome may be pointing in the wrong direction, which has consequences for how we ultimately kind of diagnose people and manage people who supposedly have overtraining syndrome.
Part of the challenge is how, what we'll get to, I'm sure, generally like quote unquote non-specific the symptoms are here. And so when you collect a bunch of non-specific symptoms and you put them into a syndrome, then you can probably end up with a whole bunch of different ways that you could get there. So it's not fundamentally going to be like one thing. Additionally, is it reasonable to think that, if you had different athletes in different sports training in different ways, that that each of them could have the same overtraining syndrome? No, it's all going to be different based on the sport, the training, and the person. But again, the non-specificity of symptoms leaves the door open for a lot of other possible causes and contributors. And so if all you know is overtraining syndrome, then you're going to miss a lot of other potential causes, contributors, risk factors, things that might be treatable and easily resolved in other ways, to a point where maybe the person can ultimately tolerate that level of training. And the training itself wasn't the underlying problem at all.
Yeah. But there's a problem with labeling, somebody with overtraining syndrome, especially if it's used maybe too aggressively, rather than with restraint. People will say your CNS is fried, your adrenals are cooked or fatigued, your nervous system, needs to recover. Not only are these phrases not supported by science, but ultimately they can produce a negative effect on the individual hearing them. They go from, I have a set of solvable input problems, that the training load maybe, to I have a broken system that needs protecting, which can produce a fear of training load, might cause somebody to prematurely deload or reduce how much exercise they're doing, and otherwise attribute, normal training-induced fatigue to a syndrome that almost certainly doesn't apply. And actually, there's been a recent systematic review that found that nocebo effects in sport and exercise had approximately twice the magnitude of effect as placebo effects when it came to performance. Now, this is based on 20 studies of varying quality, but the mechanism is not really hard to explain. Language about fatigue states and negative sort of outcomes, they have physiological consequences. The word overtrained, if it's applied imprecisely, is not neutral. It's not just a throwaway word. So Austin, can you walk us through the nocebo mechanism here, how you think about it? Because the claim that a coaching phrase produces a physiological consequence gets dismissed as purely psychological, and it isn't. What's actually going on here?
Yeah, and I would say that in the same way that when we talk about the quote unquote placebo effect, it's actually not just referring to a single thing. There are numerous different placebo effects that have been kind of characterized mechanistically. If somebody really wants to nerd out on this, there's a book by a well-known Italian guy in the space, Benedetti. I think his first name is Fabrizio Benedetti's book titled Placebo Effects, where he goes into great detail characterizing and summarizing the research that has characterized the different mechanisms of placebo-type effects. There are some that proceed by way of like endogenous opioid-related pathways, for example, for placebo-mediated pain relief. Others through other signaling mechanisms, including some of the interesting stuff, for example, around like dopamine signaling. And there's the placebo effect even in like treating Parkinsonism and things like that, which is all super interesting. And so I would be unsurprised to learn that nocebo different effects proceed by way of various different mechanisms, whether it relates to increasing pain intensity, increasing the experience of, anxiety, fear, all sorts of other things that can ultimately play into this. But I think the problem here is when people try to silo out psychology as some sort of separate process that is not intimately linked with biology. Ultimately, if we wanted to be ultra reductionist, everything is biology one way or another. And then there's going to be the chemists who argue everything's chemistry, and then the physicists who argue everything's physics, and then the mathematicians who argue everything is math. I think there's an old comic strip that that I remember that made that argument. But there is biology underlying all of these things. Psychology is like an emergent property of the underlying biological processes. And so I would not say that it is fair to dismiss nocebo as purely psychological in the same way I would say it's unfair to dismiss placebo as purely psychological. There are interactions between the psychological aspects and underlying neurology, biology, immunology, all sorts of other things. There's a whole field dedicated to this branch of study. And so when somebody does receive those sorts of external cues, whether more favorable in the context of placebo or negative in the context of nocebo, there are underlying biological impacts of that can lead to changes in attention, as well as changes in kind of underlying biology that can lead to variations in how people might experience the same subsequent event, either more favorably or more negatively.
Yeah, imagine if you walk into a gym, you're a CrossFitter, right? And the class in front of you is just getting done. And, there's all 25 people who took the previous class are on the ground, panting, writhing, or whatever. Maybe there's
pissing blood.
Yeah, exactly, right? Your expectation, your alert system is going to be elevated, most likely. And so you're going to subsequently experience that workout differently. And so it's all connected. You can't reduce it. And I think your expectations, your mood state, how you've been primed in a way to experience what's coming next or what the intervention is. Yeah, it all kind of makes sense. And the idea that, humans experience a negative sort of effect more prominently than a positive one. I mean, I think there's been some well-established psychiatric research where we tend to identify things that are negative more easily, and perhaps that's a evolutionary response on some level to protect us. But anyway, it wasn't surprising for me to learn this. It was surprising for me to see that this was still well studied in sport, because often there's a gap there. So that was kind of interesting to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. And the last thing I want to talk about before we get into the labeling or the taxonomy of this overtraining syndrome is that this is, most importantly, a diagnosis of exclusion. Because when we label somebody, or when somebody is labeled with overtraining syndrome, that means that effectively no other condition or underlying cause has been identified. You think about the prevalence of anemia, of hypothyroidism or thyroid disorders, of low energy availability, not only in sport, but also just in the general population. And their presentations are very similar to overtraining syndrome, but they're far more likely to be to have happened than an overtraining syndrome. And so if you just label somebody, you have overtraining syndrome, we got to reduce your training load, and fail to account for any of these other possibilities, that delays diagnosis, which could be a problem here. And again, I just think about, what is the prevalence of anemia just in the general population? And it's like, okay, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Mm-hmm. To me, overtraining syndrome is like a definitive zebra here, even in people who train a lot compared to just these run of the mill. And I'm not dismiss somebody's experience, but these more common sort of medical conditions. Does that ring true to you, or does that seem right?
Yes, and it also gives me an opportunity to step back onto a familiar soapbox. But ultimately, what you're describing is that these non-specific symptoms are common for a variety of reasons. Just because somebody trains, and even if they train what seems to be a fair amount, does not automatically mean that their collection of non-specific symptoms that we call a syndrome is being driven by the training. Now, the training itself might be poorly matched to the person for a variety of reasons. And so if that is the basis on which you are concluding that they are overtraining, that's a little bit of an odd way to frame it, but I kind of see how you get there. It's just that more so that this is not a good fit for them at this moment in time because of the other variable that has yet to be identified. And a common example is going to be what you mentioned with iron deficiency. The prevalence of iron deficiency in reproductive age women in the United States, 40% have iron deficiency. Now, prevalence is impacted by where you set your cutoffs on lab testing. And I have, ranted about this at length in public and with individual patients. When you measure a ferritin level and the reference range is like the lower limit of normal is 15, that is an incorrect lower limit of normal. And it should be at least 30, in my opinion, closer to 50 would be the appropriate lower limit of normal. So depending on where you set your target, that'll define the prevalence. But almost half of women in that demographic are iron deficient. And so if they train and they say, I'm tired, and you conclude they're overtrained, it's like, well, if I just got their ferritin up to 75 and they tolerate training just fine, were they overtrained, or was it just a poor fit for their iron deficient state? And so is this purely semantics, or is there something more meaningful underlying? And I think that's what we're getting at here.
Yeah. Maybe we'll keep returning to this sort of mystery symptom or mystery cause or hidden cause. We'll come back to that. But before we get into the science of overtraining, we need to get the vocabulary right, because a single word is being used to describe at least 3 distinct states. And without that information in place, everything that follows is ambiguous. So let's start with the definitions. First up is functional overreaching. This is defined as short-term performance decrease that resolves in days to approximately 2 weeks, after which performance returns to or exceeds baseline. This is, quote, super compensation working as designed. People get fitness adaptations from their training. This is what most people listening to this podcast have experienced when they've done workouts and gotten stronger, improved their cardiorespiratory fitness, increased muscle size, etc. Non-functional overreaching is when the decrease in performance extends for weeks to months. The supercompensation effect is lost. Effectively, no fitness adaptation is realized. Mood disturbances and measurable neuroendocrine changes are also present some of the time. Recovery is expected, but the timeline is challenging to predict in advance. It's defined retrospectively by how long resolution takes. And now when we get into this sort of definition, it seems more squishy than the functional overreaching one, and it gets worse from here. Because overtraining syndrome is when the decrement in performance persists for months to potentially years. Sometimes there are significant hormonal abnormalities that are observed. Sometimes you also see psychological conditions that happen alongside of this. And by definition, in the consensus statement on these definitions themselves, it is a diagnosis of exclusion. You can only arrive to it after systematically ruling out everything else that produces the same presentation. And in fact, quoting directly here, one of the guidelines-related articles says you can only differentiate between non-functional overreaching and overtraining syndrome only after a period of complete rest. So at the moment an athlete presents with fatigue and declining performance, you can't determine if they are non-functionally overreaching right then or if they're overtrained. They just have to rest. And then you got to monitor them, which Austin's already shaking his head. He's like, that seems
What's
like
the point of all this? Right, yeah.
It's a great question. What is the point of all this? Now, if you want to name it, if you think that helps your management or at least how you think about it, that's one thing. And maybe burying the lead here. I don't think this is helpful. But and there's another problem here. After any sufficiently hard workout, force production, performance, is measurably reduced. Using the strict functional overreaching definition, every athlete is technically functionally overreaching until they recover. The boundaries between these categories are squishy, again, and the retrospective labels assigned based on recovery duration, which is itself a function of training history, nutrition, sleep, life stress, genetics, etc., and measurement timing. All of that contributes here. We can't use functional overreaching versus non-functional overreaching to make a different clinical decision at the time of presentation. You just don't know. Right? What if somebody, their force production goes down after a workout, they're functionally overreached, and then weeks go by and they never get stronger? Well, it turns out you were non-functionally overreached. We didn't know. How does that affect your management here? It kind
also,
of creates
how do you know whether they just, weren't training in an intelligent way that led to the adaptations that you were looking for? Like there's this distinction of like, were you training appropriately for the goal that we had in mind?
Yeah, exactly.